Okay, welcome to part two. In the plan for today's class is to cover until the end of the primary text of the Hagadah, until the brisa of counting the amount of miracles that happened by the sea and in Mitzrayim right before the Dayenu. In response to a number of questions that came in, who are the Sfarim, who are the authors that I'm using in preparing these classes. So last week I mentioned Goldschmidt. I'll also mention the Sefer from an individual by the name of David Henschke, who has a Sefer Ma Nishtanah, excellent Sefer. There's a Sefer called Iyune Hagadah from Benish. There's a Sefer called Hagadah Ali Zayis. And of course that's just in general. And then on each individual topic, there's numerous articles in different journals that I have consulted. One correction that came back from last week was that I kept on saying that the Chabad, some say Heilach Ma'anya, and the Chabad minhag is to say Halach Ma'anya. It's the other way around. I think a more common minhag is to say Halach Ma'anya, and Chabad say Heilach Ma'anya. Okay. We're up to Ma Nishtanah. The last thing we talked about last week was the things that we're doing to propel the child to ask the questions. And the last two things that we did was we removed the kaira from the table, which we already discussed that nowadays we don't really do that anymore. At the most, we cover up the matzah at that stage. And secondly, we have poured the second cup. Pouring the second cup is going to propel the child to ask, why are you pouring a second cup? He's used to that after the first cup. You eat the meal, and here you're pouring a second cup before you've eaten the meal. And now we come to Ma Nishtanah. And the big question in Ma Nishtanah, as some have phrased it, is how many questions are there in the four questions? And of course, don't all shout out at once. Any answer that you give, whether between 0 and 5, if you say there are 0 questions, or 1 question, or 2 questions, or 3 questions, or 4 questions, or 5 questions, you will be correct according to some approach or another. And we'll get to that more in a moment. But before we get to how many questions, really, the first question we have to discuss is who is supposed to be saying the Ma Nishtanah, what exactly are the questions of the Ma Nishtanah, and what exactly is the answer to the questions of the Ma Nishtanah. Now, we already said last time that we are pouring the second cup to propel the child to ask the questions of the Ma Nishtanah, and so the question you expect the child to now ask is, why are you pouring the second cup? That's the question he should be asking. Indeed, like we mentioned last time, we always have to go back to the Mishnah to see how the Mishnah says to do things. The Mishnah says, you pour the second cup, and the child asks, and some girses it says, he asks his father, and if the child does not have enough das, he's not mature enough, or doesn't know enough knowledge, so then Aviv Melamdoi, the father, teaches him, Ma Nishtanah halayla hazeh mikol haleilos. So, the way some understand it is that the primary objective over here is to get the child to ask something. We want the child to ask questions. We want to fulfill the mitzvah of telling the story of the Exodus to the child in response to his question. The Torah says, Ki yisholcha bincha, when your son will ask you, so you need to answer a question, so we're trying to get him to ask a question. As soon as he asks a question, let's say he asks, why have you poured the second cup now? That's it. You've already done, you've accomplished that, right? What is the purpose of Ma Nishtanah? The purpose of Ma Nishtanah is for a case where the child doesn't ask any questions. You've tried all these things, but still the child is not engaging. He doesn't have any questions. So in that case, if the child doesn't have any das, in that case only, Aviv Melamdoi, the father teaches him, Ma Nishtanah halayla hazeh mikol haleilos. His father teaches him Ma Nishtanah. What does it mean that the father teaches him Ma Nishtanah? So you could say that the father teaches him to ask those questions, or the father recites those questions. And indeed, the way many Rishonim understand this Mishnah and the Hagadah, and in many ancient Haggadahs is one of the things that many ancient Haggadahs remain extant, and we could study them. In many ancient Haggadahs, where it has all the instructions, so it says the child asks, and if the child doesn't ask, then you say Ma Nishtanah. So who says Ma Nishtanah? the leader of the Seder. And when do you say man? You only say it if the child fails to ask any other questions. So then the person leading the Hagadah says Ma Nishtanah. If the child does ask questions, so then you don't need to say Ma Nishtanah at all. If there is no child present at all, let's say there's only adults, so then then it says beferish that if there's no child, so then whoever else is at the table, a person's wife, a person's colleague, a person's friend, somebody should ask somebody else the questions of the Ma Nishtanah. By the way, the Maharil writes in the name of the Machzavitri, and we're going to get back to this later, that if the child does ask the questions, so then not only do you skip Ma Nishtanah, but you skip the entire Hagadah and you go straight to Rabbi Gamliel Hoya Omer, the three things of Pesach, Matzah, and Morer, right? All the way at the end. So that's an unusual shitta, but perhaps we'll get back to it shortly. There are many virtues to this approach. The approach that Ma Nishtanah is not designed to be recited by the child, it's designed to be recited by the father. One of the values of this approach is that Ma Nishtanah has a fundamental question to it. The child is asking about things which he hasn't yet seen. At this stage in the Seder, he hasn't yet seen that you're dipping a second time. He hasn't yet seen you eating matzah. He hasn't yet seen you, what was the other thing? Okay, so we already discussed last week that that's the same as dipping the second time. So if the child is asking Ma Nishtanah, well, how does the child know that you're going to do that? Whereas if the father is the one saying the Ma Nishtanah, then it makes more sense how obviously he has that information. A similar approach is that there are no questions at all over here. This approach is similar to the first one in the sense that the point is that the child is supposed to ask a question, any question, why are you pouring the second cup or anything like that. And then Ma Nishtanah is the answer to the question. The word ma, according to this, does not mean a question, what or why. It means how. It's an exclamation of how amazing. Like ma toivu oyalecha Yaakov, how amazing are your tents, Jacob. Right? So ma can also mean ma godlo ma'asecha Hashem. How great are your, how wondrous are your ways, Hashem. Ma Nishtanah is an answer to the child. The child is asking, why are you pouring the second cup now, or any other question that the child might ask, and you're answering him. Ma Nishtanah alayla zemikol alaylas. Tonight is an amazing night. How amazing is this night? From all other nights, we do all these special things, all to commemorate the Exodus. So according to that approach, Ma Nishtanah is the beginning of the answer to the question. This seems to be the approach taken, interestingly, by the Aruch HaShulchan. It's interesting that he would take such an approach because he's a much later Pesach, and you would expect him to sort of go with the standard approach. But he does seem to be taking that approach at least somewhat. If you want to look up, it's in Siman Tov Ayin Gimel Sif Chaf Aleph in the Aruch HaShulchan. And in additionally, there is an absolutely fascinating article from an individual by the name of Richard Steiner. Now, originally, I wasn't sure if I should quote him by name, but I did find out that he is a frum Jew, and he sees it as his life mission to undermine Bible criticism. So I figured we could definitely quote him. And Richard Steiner, in his article, he brings a Hagadah with instructions in Ladino, printed in Venice in 1609, and similarly from a Seder for women, published in Ladino in 1550, and in both of those two sources, they translate into Spanish, into Ladino, Ma Nishtanah, not as a question, but as an answer, how amazing is this night? All right, but both of these approaches that we've enumerated so far are of the opinion that Ma Nishtanah is not a question for the child to ask, but rather something for the father to say to the child. However, Tosfos has a different pshat. The Gemara says a story that Abaye, Yosef Kami de Rava, Abaye was sitting in the presence of Rabbah. Now Rabbah is Abaye's uncle, and Abaye was orphaned at a young age. So presumably this story happens when Abaye is a young child, and his parents were not alive, so he was having the Seder in his uncle Rabbah's house. And Abaye saw that they removed the plate from in front of Rabbah. Amar lahu. So Abaye said to them, Adayin lo achlinon, we haven't yet eaten. Also come on, and they're removing the table from in front of us. Amar li Rabbah, so Rabbah says to him, Petarton miloy Ma Nishtanah, you have exempted us from reciting the Ma Nishtanah, right? So this seems at face value to be aligned with the first pshat. Abaya asks a question, why are you removing the kaira? He didn't ask any of the, quote, 4 questions of the Ma Nishtanah, and yet Rava tells him, we don't need to say Ma Nishtanah anymore, because you've already said a question, we don't need to say it, we only would have to say Ma Nishtanah if you didn't ask anything. By the way, some have argued that Ma Nishtanah used to be a way to refer to the whole Hagadah. Was known, we call it the Hagadah, they called it the Ma Nishtanah. So according to that, Rabbi is telling him we don't need to say the whole Hagadah once you've asked any question, which aligns with what I said before, the Maharil brings in the name of the Machzavitri. However, Tosfos says no. Tosfos says that we need the child to ask these specific questions. It's not good enough for the child to just ask why you pouring the second cup now. The reason why we want him to ask why are you pouring the second cup now is just because you want to get the child into the mode of asking. Once the child's in the mode of asking, then you hope that he's going to ask the necessary questions, which are the questions of the Ma Nishtanah. The Gemara says that Abba told Abaya that we don't need to say Ma Nishtanah once you already ask why did you remove the plate from the table, or why did you move the table. The answer is, the Gemara is not telling you the full story. Really, Abaya didn't just ask that. Abaya asked a lot of questions, including the questions on the Ma Nishtanah, and the Gemara is just giving you the bullet points, the headlines of the story. Now, this approach of Tosfos, basically, what would be the logic in saying you have to get the child to ask these specific questions? Well, the Torah says that you're supposed to tell your child in response to his question, Zevach Pesachu. You're supposed to tell him about the Korban Pesach. So it makes sense that Chazal are going to tell you, and by the way, and in addition, in another pasuk that's also talking about the response of the father to the child, it says that you're supposed to tell him, Ba'avur zeh Asa Hashem li b'tzeisim Mitzrayim, and we say later in the Hagadah, Ba'avur zeh refers to zeh, is sort of you're pointing at the matzah and maror. So the answer of the father to the child, the Torah tells us the answer is corresponding to the food. You answer your child's questions by telling him about the food, about the Pesach that you eat, the Korban Pesach, about the matzah, about the maror. Okay, so it makes sense that if the answer is about the food, then the question should also be about the food. So perhaps that's why Tosfos says that the questions of the child, it's not just that he asks any questions, he has to specifically ask about the foods of the mitzvahs of the Seder night, which is the Korban Pesach, the matzah, and the maror, all of which are included in the original Ma Nishtanah as it is in the Mishnah, and we'll get in a moment to how it is changed nowadays. B'chol ofen, this approach is the approach that has been made it halachically. In other words, the halacha, all the poskim accept the approach of Tosfos, that we need the child to ask these specific questions. And as you all know, especially in America, I think it's commonly seen that way. The highlight of the Seder is that the child asks the Ma Nishtanah. That is very strongly influenced by the approach of Tosfos to this whole sugya. Now, there is a lot of discussion about the order of the questions, which question you ask first, which one you want second, but we're going to leave that for now because there's a lot to cover, and understanding the order of the questions is important, but it's not relevant to sort of understanding the structure of what Ma Nishtanah and what the Hagadah and the Seder is all about. Now, in the Ma Nishtanah, the way we have it, there are 4 details. The first one in the Chabad, the order that we say it in Chabad, the first one is Tibble. Why do we dip? The second one is why do we eat matzah, then why do we eat maror, and why do we recline? Those are the 4 details. Now, we've already mentioned last week that the first question of why we dip, the way we word it, doesn't seem to match either approach. Last week we coined it the approach of Rashbam and approach of Rambam. The way we word the question of why do we dip doesn't seem to match either of those approaches, but the point is, whichever way you cut it, the first question pertains to karpas and or maror. In the Mishnah, there's an additional question that doesn't appear in our Hagadah, and that is about the Korban Pesach. Remember, we're especially according to Tosfos, we just said that the questions are supposed to be about the 3 foods that are the mitzvah to eat that night: Pesach, matzah, and maror. So matzah is in there, maror is in there. Pesach also used to be in there. In the days when they had the Korban Pesach, they would ask the question, why is it that on other nights of the year we eat any type of meat, and tonight we're only eating roasted meat? Okay, that's a reference to the Korban Pesach. Also, the question of reclining is absent from the Mishnah, because in those days it wasn't considered strange to see people reclining at the table. So there seems to be some change around, some change that's developed over the years, and there's different Gersayos in the Mishnah and the Brisa and the Yerushalmi, etc., as to exactly what the questions are. The Rebbe suggests, fascinatingly, that the reason why things change around is because really it doesn't matter what the child asks, right? So the Rebbe, even though we paskin like Tosfos, like this last approach, that we need the child to ask specific questions, but the Rebbe seems to be toying with the first approach, that really it doesn't matter what the child asks, it's just that he should ask any question. And so the Rebbe suggests that because the original idea was that we just want to ask the child to ask any question, so different that was fertile ground for divergent customs to develop, where different communities and different eras had different questions to focus on. But eventually we wanted to consolidate and solidify a set custom, how we're going to do it. And so it ended up with the 4 questions that we have today, which are: why do we dip, why do we eat matzah, why do we eat maror, and why do we recline? It's interesting that the Rebbe compares this to the Gemara of Iskan Rabavo B'Kisari, that this is connected to Rosh Hashanah. At Rosh Hashanah, we blow Tkiya Shvarim Teruah and Tkiya Teruah Tkiya and Tkiya Shvarim Teruah Tkiya, which are 3 different options of how to do the Tkiya, how to blow shofar, and we do all of the options because Rabbi Vo said that it wouldn't look good if some people did it this way and some people did it that way, and so everybody should be doing the same thing. So the Rebbe sort of invokes that over here, and I think that the Rebbe has a little bit of a, I don't know if the word is agenda, but the Rebbe sort of sees this as a value, that even though in theory it's okay for different people to be doing different things, but it doesn't really have a good look, and we want to consolidate for people to be doing the same thing. In a letter from the Rebbe about Parsha Zocher, which we just read a few weeks ago, so there's a widespread custom to say the word Zecher twice. You say Zecher and Zecher, which it seems clear that it didn't, even though today it is the Chabad custom, it seems that once upon a time it wasn't. And in one of the letters on this topic, the Rebbe writes, again, the same idea, that just like Rabbi Vo B'Kisari said that everybody should blow shofar the same, so the Rebbe seems to be saying, because this custom of saying Zecher Zecher has become popular in communities outside of Chabad, so then Chabad should also do it because we want to look like everybody else. So I think that sometimes we get the opposite impression about things, but I wanted to mention that. We have these different questions which developed in different places, in different stages. How many questions are there at the end of the day? So we're used to calling them the 4 questions. Everybody knows the 4 questions. In Chabad, there's the minhag to translate the Ma Nishtanah into Yiddish. The minhag of translating Ma Nishtanah into Yiddish or whatever, into the local tongue, is a very, very ancient custom, which goes back many, many centuries. And it's interesting to analyze the Yiddish translation of the various translations, Ladino, over the years, Arabic. And in the Yiddish translation, we definitely say the erste kasha, the zweite kasha, the first question, the second question. Additionally, in the Yiddish translation, there's one letter that we omit. In the Hebrew, it says, Shebechol haleilos, that on all nights we do this, that on all nights we do that. In the Yiddish, we omit that. It's just that. The first question is, why do we do this? The second question is, all nights we do this night, now we don't. You'll see in a minute that according to the different approach, the Shebechol haleilos is actually very important. So the approach that is common, the way it's manifest in the Yiddish translation, and also the way I think most people think of it, is that there are 4 different questions here. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing A, B, C, and D? Okay, if there are 4 questions, then surely there has to be 4 answers. So what are the 4 answers to the question? So one approach, and this is advanced by the Shebele Haleket, who quoting his brother Rabbi Yamin. The Shebele Haleket is an Italian sefer, and he very often quotes his brother Rabbi Yamin. And his brother says that the final question, which you asked, why do we recline? That I'm going to answer you right away. Avodim hayinu. That's the first paragraph, which now, if you're looking at your Seder, on page 398, Avodim hayinu, we were slaves to Paroi. That is, and now we are freed So that's the answer to the fourth question of why we recline. And the first three questions, according to this, are why do we have the Korban Pesach? Why do we eat matzah? And why do we eat maror? Well, the answer to that comes all the way at the end of the Hagadah, where it says, Rabbi Gamliel explains these three things. That is coming in response to the four questions. So according to this, four questions, four answers. Avodah Mayinu is the answer to the final question, and the first three questions, which pertain to the three foods, which it's a mitzvah to eat on the Seder night, that you have the three answers to in Rabbi Gamliel's words. In the book, in the Sefer of David Henschke, he very much likes this approach, and he elaborates for many, many, many pages to support this approach. And he says that the original Mishnah had to be read as follows: that Lefi datu shel ben avim melamdoi, that the Tanna Kama holds that the father has to teach the child according to the knowledge of the child, to the capability of the child. And Rabbi Gamliel Omer, he says the original doesn't have the word Haya, it's Rabbi Gamliel Omer. Rabbi Gamliel is arguing with the Tanna Kama, and he says, no, it's not good enough to just say whatever the child, according to the child's knowledge. There is a minimum that you have to say. What is the minimum? The minimum is that you have to address these questions of why do you have Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, and explain how each of those three things are associated with the story of the slavery and the Exodus redemption from Mitzrayim. The way we have it in the Mishnah, you have the whole Arami Yovedavi in between the words of the Tanna Kama and the words of the Rabbi Gamliel, so it kind of cuts the flow of things, and it's not clear that Rabbi Gamliel is pertaining to the words of the Tanna Kama. Henschke tries to prove that that's the way you're supposed to read the Mishnah. But there is another approach to the Ma Nishtanah, and that is that Ma Nishtanah is actually only one question. It's one question. Ma Nishtanah halayla hazeh mikol haleilos. Why is this night different? Not why is this night different because you're doing all these things. What happened on this night historically? What is the background? What happened once upon a time that's causing tonight to be special? And then you enumerate the four things to back up your question. How do I know that tonight that something must have happened tonight? Shebechol haleilos, and here there's the emphasis on the shebechol. In that we're doing this and we're doing this and we're doing this and we're doing this. That proves to me that there must be something going on tonight that's special. So according to this, it's only one question. And if it's only one question, what happened special on this night? Well, then there's only one answer. And the answer is what you say right away afterwards. Avodim hayinu, that we were slaves. And that is what is special about this night. So according to the more common approach, Ma Nishtanah, what is different about this night is the four things that are different on this night. And according to the second approach, what is different about this night means what is special about this night in the past, and the four things are a manifestation of that one thing. And the difference is in how you read the Hemshech of the Hagadah. According to the first approach, you have four questions, and so you need four answers. According to this approach, there's just one question: what happened on this night? What's all this about? And the answer is one thing: Avodah Mayinu. Yes.
How does Avodah Mayinu answer in both those? How does it answer the fourth question? How does it answer the one?
Well, if the answer is the fourth question, the question is why are you sitting? Why are you reclining? And the answer is because we are expressing redemption and freedom. So one way to express that is by reclining, right? According to the second approach, it doesn't. The question is what happened on this night, and the answer is we were freed from slavery. Yeah. Okay. Then we're moving on to Avodah Mayinu, and from now on you could follow in your Seder. It's on page 398. Chazal tell us, the Mishnah tells us, that the way to answer the child has to fit the framework of Maschil B'Gnus or Messiah B'Shvach. You begin with the bad and you end off with the good, right? So you start off by talking about how bad things were, and you conclude by saying how amazing things have become, right? Now that's a good way to tell a story, because if you just say, oh, everything was so good, that's one way. But if you want to make a bigger impression on the child and you describe how terrible things were initially, so then that makes a bigger impression. Now the Gemara records two opinions as to how you're supposed to do this. The opinion of Shmuel is that starting off with the gnus, with the bad, is to talk about how you used to be slaves. and ending off with the shvach, with the good, is by talking about how now you're free. And Rav talks about the more spiritual stuff that you're supposed to start by talking about how our ancestors were idolaters, and that's the bad, and the good is that we are now, Hashem brought us close to Him to be in service of and in a relationship with Him. So, L'maisa, we do both. In fact, the Ritva says that Rav and Shmuel both agree that you're supposed to do both. They're just disagreeing about which one you're supposed to start with. But we do both. And so we start off with Avodah Mayinu. We'll get to Rav in a minute. So now, Avodah Mayinu, when we recite Avodah Mayinu, we are fulfilling the mitzvah of telling the Exodus according to the approach of Shmuel. Maschel b'gnus Avodah Mayinu, we were slaves. On Messiah b'shvach, you talk about the good that Hashem Yitzienu, Hashem Elokeinu Misham, Hashem redeemed us from Egypt. Now, the paragraph of Avodah Mayinu finishes off with the statement that Kol Hamar B'Lesape B'Yitzias Mitzrayim, anybody who, how does the English translate that? Anybody who does a lot of talking about the Exodus, the more you do, the more praiseworthy you are, right? So there's the more you engage in this mitzvah of recounting the Exodus, the better it is. Now, there is a question on the Hagadah which has been bothering me for many, many years. And it still bothers me, but tonight I want to talk about it a little bit and maybe get some perspective on this. The question that's been bothering me for many years is that you would think that the mitzvah should be to tell the story of the Exodus, right? And we don't do that. We don't, in our Hagadah, we don't tell the story in any way that we would understand as storytelling. The main thing that we do in addition to Avodah Mayinu, is that we darshan the parsha of Aram Yovedavi. We take the parsha, the psukim of Aram Yovedavi, and we expound on them. And we're going to get to that and explain what that means later on. But it's certainly not, telling the story once upon a time, this and this happened, and etc. And the more details that you do over there are details in sort of minutiae in the pasuk, not minutiae in the detailed story. But I want to suggest that perhaps, according to Shmuel's, if we think of Avodah Mayinu as being, let's call it the Hagadah of Shmuel, that is in fact what Avodah Mayinu is supposed to be. There's a fascinating thing with this paragraph, Avodah Mayinu, which has, many commentaries have noted, in Goldschmidt's Hagadah, he writes, Letim Honenu, to our great shock. In the entire paragraph of Avodah Mayinu, there is not a single direct quote from a pasuk. It's paraphrasing psukim, but it's just telling the story. We were slaves and Hashem took us out with an outstretched arm, and if not for that, we would still be slaves. There isn't any direct verbatim pasuk. There's not a single pasuk that is quoted verbatim in this paragraph. Why not? So I want to suggest that perhaps in Avodah Mayinu, that is what the basis of Avodah Mayinu is. Avodah Mayinu is not, don't expound psukim, don't get all to use the Art Scroll word, biblical exegesis on me. Just tell me the story. That's what Avodah Mayinu is supposed to be. And when the last line of Avodah Mayinu tells you that if you do this at great length, it's praiseworthy, what that means is this thing that Avodah Mayinu, which is just a very loose text to tell the story in one sentence, if you elaborate on this in greater detail, that's better, right? Then there is an additional thing, which we'll get to soon, what the point of that additional thing is. The additional thing is to darshan the parsha of Aram Yovedavi, which we're going to get to later. And there's an additional thing that also there, if you do it at great length, it is praiseworthy. But they're two separate things. One is the mitzvah of telling the story in a simple storytelling fashion, which that is with the basis, the sort of the bare minimum of that is in Avodah Mayinu. Maybe you could say the bare minimum of that is Avodah Mayinu and Rabban Gamliel together. But if you want to elaborate on that, that's praiseworthy. And then there's an additional method of telling the story of the Exodus, which is much more technical and scholarly, and again, biblical drushes saying this pasuk refers to that and the other pasuk refers to this, etc., which we're going to get to later in the Hagadah. That's an additional way to do it. These are two different modes of telling the story of the Exodus. And I think that this is alluded to in the Rambam. In the Rambam, in Hilchos Chametz HaMatzah, he says two things. In the first halacha, he writes, anybody who elaborates in things that happened and that were, this is praiseworthy. So he seems to be talking about elaborating on the story line of the Exodus. And then later in Halacha Daled he writes, if you elaborate in expounding the parsha of Aram Yomidavi, that is praiseworthy. So to summarize my theory so far, and we're going to get back to it in a moment as we continue in the Haggadah, but so far what I'm suggesting is that actually there are, within the Haggadah, there are two ways of telling the story of the Exodus, two ways of fulfilling the mitzvah Yetzias Mitzrayim. One of the ways is Avodim Hayinu Vayotzienu, and that is regular storytelling. And then there's the more scholarly way, which is expounding on the parasha of Aram Yovidavi, and that comes later. And within both of them, each of them has their place. And within each of them, we say that if you do it at greater length, you are praiseworthy. Okay, let's move on. We'll get back to this theory and see how this theory carries out throughout the rest of the Haggadah. The next thing in the next two paragraphs in the Haggadah are the story of the 5 sages who were sitting in Bnei Brak and the story of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah who says, I am like 70 years old. These two paragraphs are basically, for the most part, a Maimer HaMuska. They are a parenthetic comment. They're not really negea, relevant to the primary structure of the Haggadah. And so in the interest of time, we're going to skip those two paragraphs. The Alter Rebbe actually writes explicitly in Tafayin Gimel, Sif Mem Gimel, the Alter Rebbe tells you which paragraphs are indispensable to the Haggadah, and these two paragraphs are not on that list. Okay? We're moving on to Baruch HaMokim, which in your Seder is the bottom page, the paragraph of page 398. Baruch HaMokim Baruch Hu, blessed is God who gave us the Torah, etc. That is a common introduction to Drashas HaTanoim. So we're about to start reciting a drasha from the Tanoim, and it's common in the writings of the Tanoim to introduce the drashas with, Baruch HaMokim Baruch Hu. We kind of do a similar thing, not exactly verbatim, but a similar thing when we start the 6th chapter of Pirkei Avos. So that also is kind of similar to this. And now we introduce what's known as the 4 sons. Okay, now here pay close attention to this. The 4 sons, again, the whole story with the 4 sons is not an integral part of the Haggadah. If you look back at that list in Alter Rebbe and Simon Tafayin Gimel, see if, what was it, Mem Aleph or Mem Gimel? Mem Gimel. The 4 sons is not an integral part of the Haggadah. What are we doing here with the 4 sons? I believe that the whole drasha of the 4 sons is coming to give a perspective to what we're about to do. And again, in many ways, this kind of is addressing that core question which I asked you before. Why are we saying the story of the Exodus in this convoluted way? Why don't we do this in the storytelling way? Or why don't we only do it in the storytelling way? Why do we do both? So I think that the whole thing of the drasha of the 4 sons is coming to give a perspective on what we're about to do after the 4 sons. Now, the idea of the 4 sons is not like a nice vart. Oh, there's 4 sons, and the wicked one represents this, and the wise one represents this. And we talk about, the Rebbe spoke about the 5th son. It's not just a cute vart. It is, like I said last week, all the nice vertelach add a lot, but you first have to understand the structure of it. At its base, at its core, the 4 sons is a typical drashas aksuvim familiar to anybody who's ever learned Gemara. There's an unspoken question that this drasha is coming to address. The unspoken question is that if you look at the various psukim that talk about that describe a father communicating to his child the story of the Exodus, there are 4 different places where the Torah does this. There's actually 5 if you count the beginning of Parshas Bo, but we're not going to count that. That's just, for now, we'll focus on the 4. Okay? There's 4 different times where the Torah records the father communicating to his child the story of the Exodus, and each of the 4 is in a bit of a different style. So there's this unspoken question here, which the Brisa just starts off by answering the question, that keneged arba bonim dibra Torah, that there are 4 different types of children, and each time you find the Torah recording the father communicating to his child about the story in a different style, it's because the child is different. This child is a wise one. This child is the wicked one. This child is the simple one or the foolish one, according to Tipesh, the top. And this one is the Sheni Yidei Elisha. We've just said, right before the 4 sons, we said, Kol hamarbe l'saper b'tzias Mitzrayim. If you elaborate more in the story of the Exodus, how are you supposed to elaborate more in the story of the Exodus? Well, the 4 sons tell you that it's called echad lefi inyanoi, that it depends on the nature of your son. If your son is the type who is more simple, so then you're going to give him a more simple once upon a time and tell him the story as we did in Avodah Mayinu. And if he's a more wise son, then you're going to do it in a more sophisticated Talmudic style of Drasha Saksuvim, which we're going to get to soon in the Drasha of Aram Yevidavi. In the response to the wise son, it says, "Va'af ata amarlu k'hilchas haPesach." You should tell him hilchas haPesach. Ein maftina nacha haPesach avikom. And I'll get more to the response to the wise child in a minute. But what does it mean? You're supposed to tell the child k'hilchas haPesach. So one suggestion, Rabbi Benish, the author of the Yunei Hagadah, which I referenced at the beginning of the class today, he seeks to prove that the term hilchas haPesach is the Tanaic way of referring to the Hagadah as we know it, right? So in other words, according to Benish, it's almost explicit here that the whole Hagadah, the bulk of the Hagadah as we know it, which for the most part, the bulk of the Hagadah is this drasha of the Parsha of Aram Yevidavi, this sophisticated Talmudic way of telling the story, not the once upon a time storyline thing, that is geared towards and catered for the wise son, the Chacham. It's the wise son to whom you're supposed to say the Hilchos HaPesach, which according to Benish means you're supposed to say this whole Haggadah. To the simple son, you're not supposed to say the whole Haggadah. To the simple son, you're just supposed to say the story. And you're supposed to elaborate Kol HaMarbe and elaborate in the story of the story, in the simple way of telling the story. Now, earlier we mentioned, the Machzor Vitri says that if the child does say whatever question, if he asks why you're pouring the second cup, then you skip the whole Haggadah and you just tell him the basics, the three things of Rabbi Gamliel said, Pesach, Matzah, Maror. Perhaps, I'm saying this with Derech Efsher, perhaps. The Machzor Vitri's point is that if the child is asking simple questions, so then you're supposed to give him simple answers. This Haggadah, as we know it, is not designed for the child who's asking simple questions. This Haggadah is designed for when there's no child, or the child's not capable of asking questions, in which case the adults are supposed to ask each other questions. Oh, if the adults are asking each other questions, the adults are assumed to be chachamim, they're assumed to be wise ones, and so that's when you're supposed to say the whole Haggadah, because like I said, the bulk of the Haggadah is designed as a response to the wise question. Now, and you often see advertisements for to come to a class on the Haggadah, and they'll say, "This year you should be the wise son," right? So it's a cute joke or cute catchy phrase to get you to come to the class. But according to this, it's actually true. If you want to understand the Haggadah, what we're telling you is you need to be like the wise son. Now, last week I asked, why is it that the Chayra, we do all these things on the Seder night to get the kids to ask questions, but nowadays the kids know all the things that you're going to do because they've been learning about it for a month in school. So nothing that you do is actually going to catch the child off guard, right? So perhaps we could say, at least al derech hadrush, if not in derech hapshat, that our agenda tonight in the Seder night is that we don't want our child to be the simple son who needs the once upon a time story. We want to educate us that we should be chachamim, both in the literal sense of the word for the Seder night and al derech hadrush in general, that the point is, right, we're trying to raise children who should be chachamim and should be on a level where they don't need us to elaborate on the simple storyline of once upon a time, but they should be more sophisticated and they should know all of that already, and we should be able to focus on the more sophisticated way of Hilchas HaPesach like you do to the wise son. Now, one of the biggest, there are numerous questions and things to talk about with the four sons. In the interest of time, we can't go through everything, but I just want to mention one or 2 points briefly. The biggest problem with the whole thing, the whole drasha of the four sons, is that the answers that the Haggadah tells you to give each of the four sons doesn't seem to match with what the pasuk says to give. Right? The whole thing is, the whole drasha of the four sons is based on the fact that there are 4 times where the Torah records the father communicating with his children, but then the answers don't match with that. So what's going on with that? Now, let's just talk about the wise son for a moment. in the Torah, what does the wise son say? The wise son says, Moha edus v'achukim ha'mishpatim. What are the edus chukim ha'mishpatim, or what is the basis for the edus chukim ha'mishpatim? And by the way, right, remember I just said before that perhaps according to the Machzavitri, the 4 questions of the Ma Nishtanah are the wise son questions, right? Well, that's what the wise son does. Ma, remember we said Ma Nishtanah, according to one approach, means not why are you doing all these 4 things, but what is the basis for all of these things? Ma Nishtanah, what is the basis for this, right? And that matches what the wise son says. Ma, the same word, Ma Nishtanah, Ma ha'edus v'achukim v'hamishpatim. And what does the Torah say to answer him? The Torah says to answer him, Avodim Hayinu. So perhaps you could say, and this is how the Rebbe explains it in his Hagadah, that right, we've already said Avodim Hayinu as a response to the wise son's question, but the Chachamim are telling us that you shouldn't just suffice with Avodim Hayinu, which the Torah tells you to tell the wise son, but you should elaborate even more than that, because you're supposed to elaborate even more, so you should say the whole Hagadah, and name and all the details that you're supposed to tell the child, the wise son. Now, it says that you're supposed to tell the wise son, and then it says, so one way to understand that is you're supposed to say all the details, including the very minor details, such as the halacha that you're not allowed to have dessert after you eat the matzah at the end of the Seder, which we call Afikoiman. According to Benish's way of reading it, it's actually different. According to him, Hilchas HaPesach means the whole Hagadah, which in Tanaic consciousness would have been the entire 10th chapter of the tractate of Pesachim. So you're supposed to tell him the whole 10th chapter of the tractate of Pesachim until Ein Maftir Nacha Pesach Havikoyman. That's the final Mishnah of that parak. Says Ein Maftir Nacha Pesach Havikoyman. So according to his approach, what the Hagadah is telling you to tell the wise son is the entirety of that parak until Ein Maftir Nacha Pesach Havikoyman, until and inclusive of the final Mishnah of that parak. Some have suggested that the Vart of Ein Maftir Nacha Pesach Havikoyman is that you're supposed to tell the child that we don't have dessert, and instead of dessert, we're going to focus on Hilchas HaPesach, on studying about Pesach. So it kind of matches the Chabad Minhag for Shalosh Shudas. We don't eat Shalosh Shudas, we study Torah instead. So perhaps there's some suggestion over here also that you're supposed to tell the child, why are you telling him Ein Maftir Nacha Pesach Havikoyman? You're telling him that instead of dessert, we don't need dessert tonight. Tonight we're just going to focus on Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. In the response to the wicked son, you have the expression Hakei Es Shinov. I don't know if anybody have the English Seder. How does the annotated Seder translate Hakei Es Shinov in the 3rd paragraph on 399?
Well, it's like, what is it to you? It's like, well,
No, what are the words Hakei Es Shinov? How does he translate it? How does the annotated Seder translate it? Blunt his teeth, it says? Yeah? Anyway, blunt his teeth. Yeah, blunt his teeth is the literal translation of the words Hakei Es Shinov. But I often hear people saying Hakei Es Shinov and all sorts of things about it. Hakei Es Shinov is an idiom that is found dozens or hundreds of times in Chazal, and it means to cause somebody pain or humiliation or embarrassment. So the wicked son is asking his question in a, not appropriately. So you respond to him, Hakei Es Shinov, you embarrass him and humiliate him and say, you wouldn't have been good enough to be redeemed. So that is just a translation that I think is often overlooked. All right, moving on. The next paragraph is Yochel Mirish Chodesh, which is the final almost the final paragraph, second last paragraph on 399. There are a lot of interpretations to this paragraph. The interpretation that sits best with me is that it's just a parenthetic comment, which comes in because we mentioned the pasuk Ba'avur Zeh. So we continue with Yochel Mirish Chodesh. In Goldschmidt's Hagadah, he writes that it could be that the compiler of the Hagadah saw this in the same source that he saw the previous drasha of the 4 sons, so he put it together. Okay, so we have this paragraph, Yochel Mirish Chodesh. It's parenthetic, and so in the interest of time, we are going to omit that paragraph. Okay, so now we start, again, we're telling a story, And here we're going in the opinion of Rav that the maschil begnusum b'sayim b'shvach, that you're supposed to start the story with talking about how bad it was, going on to how good it has become, is fulfilled by saying first our ancestors were idolaters, and now Hashem has brought us close to His service. And here we're already a little bit more in Chacham mode, where we're going Shenemar, and we're bringing proof to what we're saying, Shenemar, and we quote here a number of verses from the final chapter of the book of Yehoshua. Now the truth is here, I have a question, which I think is a very strong question, and it's almost surprising to me that for the most part, the commentaries don't address this, at least not explicitly. Many of them don't. And that is that the psukim that we quote from Yehoshua seem to end abruptly one pasuk short. It says, "So said God, your ancestors were on the other side of the river, and they served idols. And I took Avram, and I brought him to the land of Canaan, and I gave him many children, and I gave Yitzchak, I gave Yaakov and Esav to Yitzchak, and I gave Esav Har Seir, and Yaakov and his children went down to Egypt." Okay, we end right there after pasuk Daled of that chapter. Now, if you read one pasuk further, the pasuk continues as follows: "Va'eshlach es Moshe v'Aaron, I sent Moshe and Aaron, ve'egef es Mitzrayim, and I smote Egypt, kasher osisi b'kirboi, as it did in his mitzvah, achar yitzeis yeschem, and then I took you out of Egypt." So, if the whole point over here is to start with the bad and end with the good, wouldn't you expect that the good would be the Exodus of Egypt, which is literally the next pasuk? Why are we not quoting the next pasuk? Now, the way it's presented in our Hagadah, it seems as if, by the way, I should also mention, later on in that same chapter in Yehoshua, there's more detail. For example, in the continuation of the parak, it says, "Eidim atem b'chem ki atem bechartem lachem es Hashem la'avodah," that you're saying that you, the Jewish people, Yehoshua, as the Jewish people are confirming that they have chosen God to serve Him. So why are we not talking about any of that? And again, the primary question is that literally the next pasuk talks about the Exodus of Egypt. Why does the Baal Hagadah not bring the next pasuk? Now, the Hagadah reads, our ancestors were initially idolaters in the bottom of 399, and now Hashem has brought us close to Him to worship Him. So, what does it mean now? Who's now? So the way the Rebbe explains it in the Rebbe's commentary on the Hagadah is that now means Avraham Avinu. Initially, our ancestors, meaning Terach, they were idolaters, or even Avraham himself was an idolater early in life. And now, meaning later on, Avraham Avinu was brought close to Hashem. So according to that, the Maschil B'Gnus, to start with the bad and finish with the good refers to Avraham Avinu being taken by Hashem, not to the Exodus of Egypt. Right? Okay, and that's taka in the Psukim. So that does talk about Hashem's relationship with Avraham Avinu. Now, in the Rebbe's commentary on the Hagadah here, he references two different passages in the Zohar HaKadosh and also the Seder HaArizal. Now, I did intend to quote what it says in the Zohar there and in the Seder HaArizal, but time is running tight, so we'll skip that. But the point is that in the Zohar over there, it talks about the words Ever Hanor, specifically from the other side of the river, alluding to the great, I'll just say from the way it is in the Arizal Siddur, very briefly in the Siddur Kol Yaakov, it says that Ever Hanor refers to the Chasodim Susumim B'Meitza Hargarin, the great kindness, the great Chasodim of Hashem. So, I don't know, but it seems perhaps the reason why the Rebbe is quoting all these Zohars over here is because the Rebbe is trying to explain that, right, that these psukim that we're quoting over here do talk about the kindness. It doesn't just have the maschil b'gnus, doesn't just have the element of starting with the bad. It also includes, at least according to the Zohar's interpretation of these psukim, the finishing with the good. Okay. Other commentaries do so in different ways. If you look at Oitzim Mefarshei Hagadah from Mechon Yerushalayim, they bring commentaries that say that actually what the good is the going down into Egypt, because that was the Kur HaBarzel, which refined us to be able to come out of Egypt. To me, all of these questions, all of these interpretations are somewhat lacking, in that it would seem to be a lot more logical to say that the Messiah B'Shvach should be the next pasuk, which explicitly mentions the exodus of Egypt. So I'm not sure why that is. I don't have any good answer, but perhaps that if the theory we've been suggesting tonight, that the whole purpose of the Haggadah is to tell the story of this section of the Haggadah, is that we want to tell the story of the Exodus in a way that matches to the wise son. So it's like we specifically omit that pasuk in Yeshua because we want to tell the story of the Exodus as it emerges from the drashas aksuvim of the Parshas Aram Ovedavi, not as it is explicit in the pasuk. Anyway, I still think the question is somewhat better than the answer, and we'll leave it at that for now. Okay, we're on page 400 now. The middle two paragraphs of page 400 are Baruch Shem Avtachosai and Vihisha Amda, which, even though it seems from the Lashon of the Alter Rebbe that those two paragraphs are an integral part of the Haggadah, but still, as far as the flow of things are concerned, it's at least somewhat of a parenthetic comment. And so again, in the interest of time, we're trying to focus primarily on having a proper grasp of the core structure of the Haggadah. So we're going to skip that and go to the next paragraph, the second to last paragraph on page 400, Tzei Ulamad. Now, what we're doing over here is as follows. We are quoting 4 verses from Parshas Kisavei. And this is what I've been referring to all along in the class tonight as the drasha of Aram Yovedavi, right? And again, this is a mechanism of drasha that is familiar to anybody who's learned Gemara, even Mishnayos probably, which is we take these 4 psukim and we break them down word by word, sometimes 2 words at a time, and we elaborate on those few words. Now, tonight, in the interest of time, we're not going to go through all the details of what exactly the drasha of each of the 2 words are. That will be for another time. I've actually done a class on that in the past, and I believe it's on the YouTube, and I'll have to try and send out a link to that. But just for tonight, in the few minutes that we have remaining, just an overview of the drasha of Aram Yovedavi. The drasha of Aram Yovedavi, if you're looking at your Haggadah, starts from Tzei Ulamad, which is, like I said, the second to last paragraph on page 400, and it goes all the way through the end of the 10 plagues, which is on the top of page 404. All of those pages are dissecting, in typical Talmudic fashion, dissecting these 4 psukim of Parshas Kisavei. And for each word of the pasuk, we're either going to give you an interpretation or a limud, something we deduce from it, or elaborating on it. So, for example, it says, of a Moira Gadol, the pasuk says that Hashem redeemed us b'Moira Gadol. What does b'Moira Gadol mean? So we say, Zeh Gidul Shchina Kama Shenemar, that if you want to know what Moira Gadol means, I'm going to bring you another pasuk that will clarify that Moira Gadol means the revelation of the Shechina, Hashem being revealed. Okay, so you're taking one word, which is 2 words, Moira Gadol, great awesomeness. What does great awesomeness mean? So we say, it refers to the Gilui Shechina, and then we bring a whole pasuk which elaborates on it even more, where it tells you a little bit about the Gilui Shechina. Where is that? It's on page 403. Yeah, Kabashan Emar. Did any God try to come and take out one nation from within another nation with wonders and miracles and signs and wars and outstretched arms and a strong, mighty hand and with great awesomeness, as Hashem did in front of you, in front of your eyes in Egypt, right? So in the pasuk that we're expounding, we have two words, Moira Gadol, and we've now extrapolated and said a whole long pasuk which describes in greater detail what the Torah is referring to with those two words. That's a typical Rosh Hashanah. You have two words, and we say, oh, actually, it means this whole bigger thing. Sometimes you get more detail. For example, you know what? We won't go through too many examples now, but that's basically the gist of what this whole drasha is about. We take these 4 psukim and then we break it down word by word. So the first pasuk says, and then we break it down. Aram Yevidavi means this, Vayed Mitzrayim means this, Vayagosham means this, Vimseimat means this, etc., etc. That is the method of Talmudic extrapolation and analyzing and exegesis of psukim. That is typical in Chazal, and that's what we're doing over here with the whole drasha of Aram Yevidavi. I should mention that in the middle we have over there the pasuk Ve'ever Elayich Ve'erech Mispiseses B'Domayich, which is not really part of. I'm sorry, the next pasuk Revava Katzemach Hasad Nesatich, which is not originally part of the drasha, and that is added into the Hagadah based on the teachings of the Arizal, and we'll leave it at that for now. Okay, and so that brings it to a close tonight's class, and in Yetz Hashem, part 3, we have to see exactly when part 3 is going to be. Maybe it'll be on Sunday or Monday next week. We'll start from Rabbi Yossi Aglili. We'll talk a little bit about the Bryce of Rabbi Yossi Aglili, maybe a little bit about the Yenu, and then going on to Matzah, Morer, Koireh, Haroisas, etc., to explain what all of those things are about.